know from Canada where it's 8 o'clock in the morning. So to start for my day and an end of yours. So looking forward to sharing some thoughts. I do want to say the focus for my talk will be primarily on what I would call the operationalization on how to operationalize critical thinking. So we'll do a little bit of just kind of framing, how I'm seeing or defining critical thinking, which I know was in your last talk. But the bulk of my talk will be strategies and approaches. There's lots and lots of conversation out there about why critical thinking is important, why it matters, what is it? I find often, though, there's less around, but how do I do it? So I want to focus on moving from the rhetoric and the conversation about defining it to, so how does that look played out in various classroom contexts? And I want to start off right off the bat, if you don't mind, asking if you wouldn't mind just doing this anticipation guide. And you don't have to tell me, you don't have to put it in the chat, but if you would just make a note, because I'm hoping if we get through everything, that we're going to return to this at the end of the talk. But I just want you to read through these 5 statements and decide if the essays, do you strongly agree with the statement, agree, disagree, or strongly disagree? Okay, so strongly agree, disagree, or strongly disagree. I'll just give you a minute or two to read through and make notes to yourself, because we're going to revisit this later.
And then a problem. Dr. Galford, is there any problem?
No, I just wanted to, has everyone had a chance to read through all the statements?
Oh, okay.
Okay, we're going to revisit them. I hope you've had a chance at least to skim and think about them, but we'll revisit this. This question I would like to see either on the mic or in the chat. I'd like you to respond to this contention, this claim that teaching content should not be seen as a goal of education, but rather a necessary intellectual tool for solving problems and responding to provocative issues or meaningful challenges. I'd like just to get a sense of, do you agree with that statement? Do you partially agree with the statement? Do you disagree with the statement? Teaching content should not be our goal in education, but it is a necessary intellectual tool to solve problems. Just to give you, again, 30 seconds, and you can throw in the chat, agree, disagree, or jump on the mic and tell me, what do you think? Do you agree or disagree with the statement, or somewhere in between? Okay, so I've got an agree to start us off. By the way, I'm going to tell you, as you're thinking about this, the reason I'm posing the question is the number of times I encounter educators, certainly in upper high school or even early university, that feel that they have to teach the biology, they have to teach the theories, they have to teach the content, and that's their primary goal, to get kids ready for an exam, so they have to know the content. And I want to, by the way, I want you to notice this statement, sometimes it gets read by people to think that I'm saying content's not important. And I hope as you're agreeing that you're saying, actually, I'm arguing content is very important, but it's not the end goal. It's the tool. It's a vehicle that allows me to reach the goal of students being able to engage in meaningful ways in the world they're living in issues they're dealing with, that without that foundation, they're going to struggle. But notice, for me, it's a tool, not the goal itself. And I want to use that to suggest to you that schools have traditionally been what I would refer to as knowledge hierarchies. And students perceive schools as knowledge hierarchies. And what I mean, how many of you have seen, if it's in a book, if it's in a textbook, it's true. Would that be fair? That your students would believe you don't challenge what's in the text. Is that fair? So I'm just reading the concept. Interesting. So I'm just reading the comment about the content, the hidden objectives. So I'm curious, as I said, that often students will feel reluctant to question something I might present in a lecture because I'm perceived to be the expert, and therefore what I'm saying must be true. If it's in a textbook, it must be true. If they read it somewhere, they just assume truth. And I would argue that we've created this sense of knowledge hierarchies. What you're looking at on the triangle, you may be familiar with, is Bloom's taxonomy. And since the 1956, when Benjamin Bloom first published his idea of this taxonomy, we've used this, certainly in the West, as a pedagogical frame. And I would suggest to you it has gotten in the way of critical thinking. It's most often used to promote, to work towards low order, towards high order thinking. You will notice that throughout my talk, I won't use the terms low order thinking and high order thinking. I would argue you're either being thoughtless or you're being thoughtful. Like either you're engaged in thinking or you're not. I'm not really sure what low order thinking, what that means. And I'll show you what I mean by that. Our assumption that knowledge doesn't require thinking is flawed. Am I selecting knowledge that's relevant, that's useful? It should be a critical thinking exercise. I want to suggest to you that Bloom's taxonomy, in fact, has gotten in the way of promoting thinking because it's led us to teach in a way that we first impart information. And once the information has been imparted, then later we invite kids to think. We invite our students to think after the content's being delivered. And I want to suggest that we want to move away from that notion of a knowledge hierarchy to what are better referred to as knowledge networks. That as a community of thinkers and learners, and I love that in the comments made at the beginning, the idea of creating a community where we learn together. And the elements of critical inquiry, one of the courses I'm teaching, I start next week, is a graduate course actually in creativity and sustained inquiry. How do we get at innovation and creativity through a sustained inquiry approach? And at the core of any critical inquiry approach is asking those relevant, provocative questions. They said at the core. And you'll notice my arrows go in multiple directions because it's not a linear progression like Bloom's taxonomy where I impart and then I move up the pyramid. Rather, I do that we invite students to share their initial thoughts.
Hi, how are you?
Sorry, please unmute your microphone.
What?
Dear participants, please unmute your microphone because we can't hear our keynote speaker.
Yes.
There we go. Okay. So as I was saying, at the core of the learning is a provocative question, and we might invite students to share what they think they know, reflect on what they heard from others. They might investigate first, begin constructing a response, then share. That it's a much more organic process than a linear process. And I love this notion. David Weinberger, who wrote a book about 3 or 4 years ago called Too Big to Know. And his notion is that in a digital world, there is so much information out there. It's very difficult for any one person to be the expert. And I love his subtitle is that the smartest person in the room is the room. And his idea being that the best way to solve complex problems is to collaborate in these knowledge, what we'd call a knowledge network, that the greatest power lies in that network. Now, I want to show you as well, making the case, and what I've just been suggesting to you is that critical thinking needs to become the driver for learning, the foundation for learning, not the end. So not once we've imparted information, now we'll engage students in thinking. Instead, it should be the starting point. You'll notice these statements from a variety of of authors. So I've put here, Art Costa, who does a lot of work on habits of mind. But notice he says that thinking is innate. We all think. It's human beings we think. But skillful thinking must be cultivated. So of course our students are thinking, how can I help them be skillful? My co-author on my book, we have a book on creating thinking classrooms. My co-author, Roland Case, who's also the founder of the Critical Thinking Consortium I work with, notice he said that students who passively receive information, who sit and receive information, are less likely to understand than students who have critically scrutinized, interpreted, and applied. This is a really important notion. Even if teaching content is my goal, students are more likely to remember and understand it if they've been engaged in thinking when they learned it. And Nell Noddings in California said, any subject, physics, art, or auto repair, can promote critical thinking as long as teachers teach in intellectually challenging ways. In other words, it's not the subject, but the way we teach the subject that ensures critical thinking. So I wanted to just show you very, very briefly an example. When my daughter's degree is in neuroscience, and in a course, biology course, I want to show you a little bit of the video that her professor used the very first class. Now, here's the question that was asked, okay? The very first class, let's see if I can throw this in the chat. The teacher asked this question, okay? The professor put forward this question. How many cellular processes, putting this in the chat, can you find in this video? Okay, so this is the question. How many cellular processes can you find? And remember, this is 5 minutes into the course. It just begins, and then they show this video. Now, I won't show all of it for lack of time, but I wanted to show you just a bit. So the question was posed to the students, how many cellular processes can you find? And then the follow-up, if you understand this course, you should find 16 by the end of the course. That question was asked the first day. It had the students looking, paying attention. Every lecture they attended, my daughter would come home, replay the video, and see if she could find some more. By the way, she told me coming out of high school, she could find, she said, about 6. Every class, she would see if she could watch it again, find another. It was a wonderful way to engage them. They showed the video halfway through the course and at the end of the course. It gave her a way to check in on her own learning, see how she was doing. Now, I want to just really quickly just shape, when I'm talking about critical thinking, how am I defining it? But before I do that, I'm going to ask you, this is a study done by Richard Paul a number of years ago in California. He surveyed professors at a variety of universities across California, places like Stanford, UCLA, and so on. And he asked the professors about critical thinking. And this is what he found in their response. 89% of the faculty, and I think that's why we're here today, viewed critical thinking as a primary educational objective. But you'll notice, although widespread support that it's important, only 19% could explain it. So widespread support that it's important, but only 19% of the professors could actually define what it meant. 78% of the faculty said the students lacked the criteria necessary to be able to assess their own thinking, but when asked, only 8% could provide a list of the intellectual criteria that they would require of their students. 82% of the faculty involved students thinking critically at least once per class, but only 15% required it in writing. And 77% had little or no idea how to reconcile content coverage while still fostering critical thinking. Now, 3 of those statements actually came from Richard Paul's study. One of them I made up. So your little challenge, which of those is not the right, which of those statements is not true? Which did I make up? Now, 2 clues to help you. Which of those 4 statements does not fit with my title? And which is inconsistent with the other 3? So again, I'm just going to give you a minute, but if you wouldn't mind in the chat, please, letting me know, and you can send it private if you want. Let me know which 1, 2, 3, 4, A, B, C, D, whichever you would like, but which is the false statement? Which one did I make up?
I guess we can do it in question and answer session. If
Well, what I'd like to know is, you don't have to answer this, but I wonder how many of you, when I ask my question, first reread the statements. When I do this face-to-face with people, I will normally find people will pause and there'll be no talking in the room because they're all rereading the statements. And I usually point out, but I read the statements to you. Why did you need to reread them? And the answer is, well, because I hadn't really digested them. See, I want you to note, when I put a note up on a board, when I project a note on a screen, students would typically, if I didn't tell you there's a false statement, would just assume this is true. This is the knowledge hierarchy I spoke of. Oh, here's an expert on critical thinking. He's citing a study. He tells me 4 things. I just believe them. Well, maybe we shouldn't. Maybe I should question whether or not that actually makes sense. And what I was showing you is a strategy to problematize even something as simple as note taking. Even days in which I'm going to provide content to my students, I can problematize the content by doing a couple of things. In this case, I gave a false statement. And I can say to my students, stop copying everything down that you see and assuming it to be true. What in here doesn't make a whole lot of sense to you? What seems problematic? Here's another way. Maybe I put up 10 statements. I say, all of these are true. None of these are made up. These are all true. It's not all important. I want you to only put 6 of the statements in your notes. Leave 4 out. Which ones would you leave out? What I'm trying to do is to force students to think about the content, not simply accept the content. By the way, I'm doing this because what I'm trying to model is that thinking, if we truly value thinking, it needs to be routine. It's every day in my class. It's the way we learn. It's the methodology of learning. It's not after I've imparted content to you, then I'll ask you to apply critical thinking. I'm just looking at Aspa's comment that we're meant to believe stats. You're exactly right. And then you focus on the lecture. Notice what I'm doing is saying I wanted to pause, give you a minute to reread, think about those numbers, think about, and as you start playing with them, most people will start to say, wait a minute, how can 82% involve them in critical thinking if only 19% understood? The numbers don't line up. But this is a really good point. It's how we listen, and it's creating the space, the time within that lecture for someone to pause and think about. But I just wanted to show you that as a very easy strategy to problematize a lecture, to problematize content delivery. Content matters, but teaching in a way that engages thinking, it matters even more. So I want to just move to, when we create a thinking classroom, we're talking about not thinking periodically, but thinking as the foundation for learning, the way students engage with on a daily basis. The definition, TC squared, stands for the Critical Thinking Consortium, the group that I work with. And our definition that we've adopted in critical thinking is it's inviting students to work through a problematic situation. That's why we talk about problematizing curriculum, where the thinker makes a reasoned judgment. So notice a really important part, a reasoned judgment. So there has to be a decision of some kind using a set of intellectual tools. So this is the framework that we work from. It's the framework that underpins our book on creating thinking classrooms, that we see kind of 4 key fronts that I want to just quickly touch on. One is, how do we shape the climate for thinking? If my classroom is one where students think that I hold all the correct answers and their job is to get the answers from me, I don't have a thinking classroom, because I have the students just accepting whatever I say. I have to create the kind of questions that invite them into the conversation. If I have a classroom climate where my questions invite the retrieval of information, and the top students are the ones who can quickly retrieve the right content, I don't have a thinking classroom. So how do I create the climate where thinking is encouraged, promoted, sustained on a daily basis? To do that, I also have to look at, how do I create the opportunities? How do I rethink how I frame my question to ensure it invites a thinking response? How do I create those opportunities like I just did when I'm just teaching content? How can I teach content in a way that invites thinking? The second part, so the top part, is how do I create the climate, the opportunities? The other part is, how do I build their capacity? Because asking better questions, asking rich questions, doesn't mean you get better answers. It just means you've asked a better question. Unless I build the student's capacity, they're not going to be able to give me better answers. And you'll notice we've identified 5 intellectual tools students need to do that quality thinking that we want. I mentioned earlier the importance of content, building background knowledge, whether that background knowledge is something students brought with them as prior learning, or it's what they're learning through a lecture, through a reading, through an experience. We need to build background knowledge, because you can't think deeply about something you know nothing about. You need to have the content background to be able to make thoughtful decisions. But the second part is the criteria. Keep in mind, all critical thinking is criterial thinking. Critical thinking, the mistake that's often made is to assume that critical thinking is to be critical. Often our students will think that being critical, being a critical thinker, is to criticize. That's the wrong root. Critical thinking does not come from the root to criticize. It comes from the Greek word krikos, meaning criteria. All critical thinking is criterial thinking. It's making thoughtful or reasoned judgments in light of a set of criteria and a body of evidence. So the 2 foundations of all critical thinking: do I have something to think about? Do I have the content or the background? And have I established some criteria to guide me in my deliberations? Is there some criteria that I'm going to base this on? So if I were to ask you, is it ethical for the government to take a certain action? The first thing I'd have to do is identify the criteria for ethical that I'm using. How are you defining ethical? And if I have that criteria and I look at the evidence in light of the criteria, I can reach a reasoned judgment. The third intellectual tool is thinking vocabulary. Depending on the grade level and the students you teach, this will vary, but this is not the language of the subject. So, in economics, understanding, microeconomics, understanding opportunity costs, understanding the Gini coefficient, those are background knowledge. If I ask you to analyze a document, but you don't actually understand what it means to analyze, then you struggle. If I ask you, what can we infer from this, but our students don't have a clear understanding of what an inference is, then they'll struggle. So do they understand the language that frames the question? What are the thinking strategies that we're providing our students? How are we helping them to make connections, to be able to take that content, use the criteria to organize it, and reach some kind of decision? And I mentioned Art Costa's work in Habits of Mind. What are the habits of good thinkers? Good thinkers are open-minded, they persevere, they're full-minded, they don't make decisions without first becoming informed. These are the habits that we want to work with. Now, that in itself could be a whole different talk, just unpacking these tools. But I wanted to talk about a bit about agency today. We could certainly in the future unpack the other, but I want to talk a little bit about agency, in part because sometimes agency can be reduced down to giving students voice and choice. And I want to suggest to you that that is insufficient if we really want to promote deep understanding, deep thinking, and learner agency. Agency, in fact, involves two key elements: the will or the desire to learn, that I see value in this, I see meaning, so I want to learn, I genuinely want to, I'm not doing this just out of compliance, and you've built my capacity to learn. And I've chosen the yin yang just because I'm not so sure these can be clearly separated. They probably intersect in different ways. But what we've started to look at is that in nurturing the will, have I framed my questions and the learning in a way that inspires students? They see value and meaning in it. Is it inclusive? Do they see themselves represented in it? Do they feel that they can flourish and be successful? That begins to bleed into the capacity. Am I teaching in a way that the concepts are transferable, that students are able to take what they're learning in my class and see connections to the world beyond the class? Am I empowering them with those intellectual tools? And am I nurturing a deep understanding? So I want to touch on some tools we do that with, but I wanted to show you this piece first. About a year and a half ago, and at the end, I can bring back up my email and my Twitter if you're interested, and I can share anything. If there's anything I'm using that you're interested in, you can let me know, and I'm happy to share them with you. My wife and I wrote an article exploring the link between assessment and instruction. And our argument is that in education, we need to, we use the double helix as our analogy, that the double helix is of the DNA strand, like what gives it its strength. And our argument is that assessment and instruction too often are kind of separate pillars or separate tracks in education that we instruct, through a lesson, through a seminar, whatever it might be, and then periodically we pause and we assess. And our argument is that we need to seamlessly weave these together if we're going to create the most powerful conditions for learning, that we need to adopt a position where assessment and instruction are seamlessly woven together through the relationships we build to help students learn. Now, I'm going to try to touch on, I said that this talk would focus on how to operationalize this. So I've been making a case, trying to make the case that critical thinking should be just how we learn. It should be the foundation, the methodology of learning, and therefore it should be happening every day in our classes. So if we're going to do that, I want to suggest, aside from those 5 intellectual tools that underpin, I want to suggest 5 other practices that can help support learner agency and that thinking. Now, you heard earlier in the introduction a reference to gaming. And part of my thinking around, I'm going to talk about something I call a cascading design, which I'll show you in just a minute. But it was inspired by gaming. And I don't know if any of you are yourselves gamers or live with someone who's a gamer or know gamers. I was intrigued 5 or 6 years ago when we were writing our book on thinking classrooms. I was intrigued by how many people were playing Angry Birds. I found out in some research that Angry Birds was being played 200 million hours, 200 million hours a year around the world. That's the equivalent of 16 years of time being invested every day in people launching birds at these green pigs. Okay? And I was astounded. I thought, wow, what is it that game developers understand? What is it that game developers understand about how to get and hold attention that maybe we could pay attention to in school? And the answer to my question came, I was delivering a keynote talk in Madrid, Spain. It was a brain research conference. And the speaker before my talk, her focus was on sustained attention. And she posed the question, how do we best sustain student attention? How do we get and hold student attention? And she pointed out that attention connects to the pleasure center of the brain. That when we are learning something that we see value, that we're interested in, you get a shot of dopamine in the brain. It's the feel-good neurotransmitter. You want more. Okay, so when we are engaged in activities that give us that shot of dopamine, we enjoy, we want more. By the way, coffee is a natural dopamine booster. Chocolate is a dopamine booster. And often people will, want a coffee in the morning. They get that shot of dopamine. But the breakthrough for me, the aha moment, was when she pointed out that another major source of dopamine is being successful at meeting a challenge. It's that rush you get when you've been working at something and it pays off and you go, yes, I got it. And you're excited by that. By the way, you'll notice I bolded the two words, achieving success at a challenge. If you give me a task to do, so sitting in a lecture, copying notes from a screen, or just copying what someone is saying, I can do it. It hasn't challenged me cognitively. It's not a challenge. I can do it, but I'm not getting that dopamine rush. If I flip that, you gave me a really difficult challenge, but I have no background and I have no chance of solving it. I won't get that rush. I'll just feel defeated. We need to find that balance, that I've given you a challenge, but I've given you the tools that make the challenge manageable or doable. So I want to share what that might look like. And I want to suggest you, and this is kind of the key piece for this section. I want to suggest to you that we want to shift schools from what I would call a proof of learning model. I think most schools in many parts of the world are built around a proof of learning model. We use terms like summative tasks or culminating tasks. And you may use other terms, but you'll notice or final evaluations. We tend to instruct, impart information to students, and then stop at the end and say, now prove you've learned by writing this exam, by completing this assignment, by doing whatever it might be. I hope you notice that's a proof of learning. I'm going to teach first, and then you're going to prove you've learned it by completing my task. And I want you to consider flipping that on end. I want you to consider, what if the rich task that you give me was the first day? It becomes the invitation to learn, the challenge for me. And every day you come to my class, by the way, remember what I showed you with that biology class. The video was shown the first day, and the students were asked, how many cellular processes can you find? The challenge was up front. It was the invitation to learn. And every lecture, as new content was delivered, the students said, oh, I think I found another one. They were engaged in the learning and the thinking throughout. Instead of, by the way, that video could have been used in the last class. Think of the impact. I've just taught you for 12 weeks. Now, watch this video. If you've been paying attention, you should find 16 cellular processes. And I can't find them. I'm in a panic. So one way it's a proof of learning. The more powerful way is an invitation to learn. So I wanted to show you, this is what I call a cascading design. It's just the way that I think through, if I were to meet with you to say, could you help me plan a course or plan a unit in a course I'm teaching? I would tend to pull out a blank version of this cascade, and I would start with, okay, what's the rich question we want students to explore? What could we ask, and what do we want them to do? And I want to give you an example. Grade 11 physics class. The students were asked, in baseball, what causes a curveball to curve, and why is it difficult to hit? Okay, so their question, in baseball, why does a curveball curve, and why is it difficult to hit? Now, I thought that was a great question, very challenging question. And I asked the teacher to talk to me about it. And as we talked, what came out was that question was asked at the end of the unit. It was a proof of learning. I've taught you about Newton's laws of motion. And now prove you understand Newton's laws of motion by answering this question. So notice that's a proof of learning model. I've taught all about Newton's laws. You have the next 3 days to come up with an answer using what we've learned. And I asked him, what if we flip that on end? What if the first day the students came into the class, You showed them a video of a curveball curving, and you asked them, why do you think that curveball curved? I want you to take out a piece of paper, or take out your tablet. I don't care if you draw a picture to explain it, write an equation, describe in words. Why do you think that curveball curved? By the way, you'll notice that will tell me what my students know coming into the unit, what misconceptions they might have, what gaps they have. And it's okay for them to say, I really don't know right now. No problem. I asked the teacher, so if I'm going to answer that question, what would I have to know? He said, if you understand these 4 concepts, acceleration due to gravity and so on, he outlined the 4 big concepts. If you know that, you'll nail this. Basically, we back mapped his unit by saying, okay, so how could we help them to understand acceleration due to gravity? How do we help them understand these concepts? But you'll notice what happened is the unit went from being, first I teach about the subject, and then I give a challenging task, to turning that on end and inviting students to offer an answer and then change or refine that answer as they learned. I'm going to just show you a couple of other examples. And sorry, they're just, I've got dozens of these, but I pulled a couple. This was for a biology course in a senior high school class. The students were to grapple with this question. The teacher wanted them to answer, to what extent should we be able to alter the human genome? Okay, so that's what they're going to be thinking about. We would build criteria for what is ethical in science. Their challenge was to use a medium of their choice to provide a set of advice to policymakers on the editing. They know up front, you need to create a set of advice. You can do it however you want. And then we broke it down into 4, I call them focus inquiries, that make this complex task more manageable. They look at historical contributions that have changed our understanding of molecular genetics. They look at changing gene expression, at mutations. You can see they look at a, and every time they look at one of these issues, they're feeding that into their advice. So all of the focus inquiries, in a university setting, these could be each week, we're going to have a focus lecture on one of these, and you need to take that and think about how that will help advance your answer. But notice, instead of the task being, now that you've learned it, it's flipped around. This was a history one, where students were asked to think about what lessons from the past can we learn, either what not to do, because look at the disastrous results, or what to do. What could we learn from? We broke it down. Students looked at how past civilizations have interacted with their natural environment. What can we learn about mistakes or things that worked? They looked about, if we want to live in harmony, what can we learn from the past that where conflict has arisen that we could avoid in the future? We want to think about the role of the arts. We want to think about faith and how that helps us understand who we are and the role it's played. And each of these are feeding into, in this case, an essay. This is one that we just recently developed in a philosophy course. Was Socrates right to claim that the unexamined life is not worth living? The task kids were given, witness to yesterday, is where one student playing the role of a modern day journalist interviews a historical character. So the students were going to create a witness to yesterday in either a podcast or video form, where a modern day interviewer interviews Socrates about his claim that the unexamined life is not worth living. To get them ready for it, we explored what is meant by an examined life. What's the most effective way to examine? How do we promote or enhance the examination? So they use philosophy to explore this concept, and they use that then for the rich tasks that they're developing. I'm just going to do a quick pause to see if there are any questions on that notion of a cascading approach to learning, where we flip on end where we place the rich task so that thinking is happening every day in your class. So just if there are any questions, let me know. And if not, I will continue to move along. Okay, I'm going to keep moving just for time. Again, remember, if these are all Word documents, if anyone's saying, hey, I'm intrigued by this, I'd like to see a copy, I'd be happy to share something with you. I've told you this is about how do I build the operationalizing, the tools to help me operationalize critical thinking. Well, I frame my question as a critical thinking task. I give kids that overarching task to work with. I want to create the climate, and I've heard this said. You guys said it. I've said it before. How do we create the climate for thinking? And part of that is creating iterative opportunities. And by iterative, I mean looping back, being able to try out an answer. One of the things that will undermine critical thinking in your class, if students are afraid to test an answer, if they don't believe, if they think offering a wrong answer will harm them, they will not engage critically. I want to create the conditions in my class where students will test out an answer. And then it doesn't work, they say, oh, that's okay, because given my new learning, I want to loop back and change my answer or add to my answer. So I've been developing what I call learning launches for this. So learning launches are a strategy that invites students to offer an initial thought, but they're allowed on a daily basis or every class, because you may not see them on a daily basis, as they learn, as their thinking emerges, to adjust their response. And so they begin to see that it's okay to try out answers, to test answers, and it's okay to see, you know what, that answer actually doesn't work so well. I'm just going to give you a few examples, and some of these are from across grade levels, and you'll have to think about them in terms of adjusting to the students that you teach. I was working with a science class, and they were examining the organ systems in the human body. So the question that they were asked is Groot, so I'm just going to put this. Groot is a character, if you're not familiar, from a movie called Guardians of the Galaxy. And he is this, the character in the center, you kind of see in the watermark in the background, his name's Groot. He only says, I am Groot. Those are the only words he says. And he looks like a tree, kind of grows like a tree, but he walks around. The students were asked, is Groot more plant or animal? You'll notice, and this is a very important part in how I'm framing my question, I don't ask it as a binary. Is Groot a plant or an animal? That limits the discourse. I ask students to take a position, we call this a dashboard. Where would you be? Would you be leaning towards he's somewhat more plant? Is he a lot more plant? Is he somewhat more animal? Students take a position on the dashboard. Then, as they learn about the digestive system, the respiratory system, whatever it might be, they're invited to come back repeatedly to my dashboard and say, well, now, given what you've been learning, what do you think? And tell me why you've changed your mind, or tell me why you're even more convinced. So a dashboard is one way. Here's another type of launch. We asked a question of students, how do we understand conflict? And in a Canadian context, looking at treatment of Indigenous people, how do we explain the mistreatment of Indigenous people during the 19th century? Okay, so notice it's not, were they mistreated? Yes, there was a mistreatment. How do we explain it? And the students are asked to create a pie graph to illustrate the degree. By the way, we gave students 4 underlying causes of conflict. That conflict often arises as a result of a power struggle, greed, cultural misunderstandings, or prejudice. To what degree do you think each of these contributed? In this case, the student is saying, I think prejudice played the biggest role. I think there may have been some cultural misunderstanding, but I think it was minimal. And I think greed was the second biggest. Now, remember, that's what I'm asking as we start the learning. As they begin to learn about the historical events, they may choose to adjust some of these. I actually think greed played a bigger role, which means I have to shrink this one. There's a constant interplay between the lecture they're listening to, the reading they're completing, whatever the kids are learning about, and how they're framing their response. But they know that they'll have an opportunity to revise their thinking as they learn. Let's show you using a ranking ladder. Anytime you have a list in your teaching and you ask students to rank it, you move it from a question of list. If I said to you, what are the greatest threats to democracy? And you just gave me a list, there's no judgment, there's no critical thinking. But if I ask you to rank that list, suddenly it becomes a critical thinking question. So ranking immediately turns a question of just delivery of content into a critical thinking opportunity. So I might say to students, here are 5 things commonly attributed to weakening democracy, voter apathy, misinformation that's out there, populist approaches, wealth inequalities, media concentration in a few hands. Could you please put them on my ranking ladder from the one that you think is having the greatest impact on undermining democracy to the 5th? Remember, I'm doing that day 1. I have a conversation. So why'd you guys place them there? Interesting to see the differences. We talk it through, and then we look at a reading. We listen to a lecture. We engage in the learning. And at the end of each class, I ask my students, would anyone change the order? If not, how would you defend your order? Given what you learned today, how does it support what you said? Or has it caused you to rethink it? And we have this ongoing dialogue. This one is using like a midway game where if your squirt gun is accurate, your horse wins the race. I want students to think about childhood obesity. Which factors are having the biggest impact? You'll notice this blends a dashboard with a ranking ladder. How important a role does genetics play in childhood obesity? And the students have to decide from very little to substantial. How about not getting enough sleep? Does lack of sleep? And they have to decide. So they both rank, but they also take each individually. We do that at the beginning. As they learn the science behind obesity, they can change their mind or they can affirm their answer. I want to show you just a couple of other things. I see our time is running short. I've been encouraging this idea of getting the question up front in a way that invites a critically thoughtful response.
Yes, Dr. Goffin, do you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Yeah, we can't hear you.
My computer shut down.
Oh.
You can hear me okay. Okay, I just got to pull up my PowerPoint. I'll be ready to restart in 1 second.
Yeah,
Can you make sure that
could you please repeat the last
Yes.
the last word? What you said, because we couldn't hear, and I guess that there's some problems.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Now, can you just want to make sure I'm able to share my screen?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, right now I can't. So if you can allow me to share my screen, that would be great.
It's okay. We can follow it in question and answer session.
Well, sorry, I was just going to finish the slide, but I can't share my screen right now. So if you could allow participants to share screens, that would be. Or if you could make me co-host, that would do too.
Yeah, I'm trying.
Okay.
Unfortunately, it was that one. Yep.
If you click on share screen.
Yes, I've already done, but I'm waiting.
Yeah.
Yep. Okay, sure. Unfortunately, it's not be shared. I didn't understand what the problem, but okay, maybe we should just go to our questions if
Sure.
if the slide is already finished. Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah, because No, unfortunately.
Okay.
Some problems. Okay. I think that it's not a big problem because if we have already finished, and I guess that we can follow it in our question and answer session. Thank you very much for such interesting, inclusive presentation. I think that there's an opportunity to share it with our participants if they would like to get it.
And I'm just going to put I was going to do it by a slide, but I'll put it in the chat for now, my email.
Okay, great.
And sure, we can go to the questions and I can add whatever there.
Yeah. So once more, thank you very much for the inclusive presentation. Yeah, you can find it, Dr. Newman's email as well in the chat. And you're absolutely right that critical thinking is not criticizing, but it's actually analyzing and judgment as well as refining the knowledge and achieve success through challenge. And it's great that actually through critical thinking, students learn to take positions and learn to define and underpin the position that is most important. So I think that it's time to go to questions. Are there any questions? You can unmute your microphone and ask for speech, please. There's someone who wanted to ask Dr. Golford about today's webinar, about today's presentation.
Ma'am, I ask one question?
Yes, of course, you're welcome.
Ma'am, it is important for our student to be productive member of the work force. How can school better prepare student to meet these challenges?
Can you expand on, like, what would you see as one of the primary challenges that we need to prepare them better for?
Yes, sir.
Yes. Can you just you said that we need to better prepare students for challenges. Can you give me? Yes. Thank you.
Student ask too much questions about any topic or lecture. So that's about.
Yeah. Well, one of the things I think we want to do is, I was talking briefly at the beginning of my talk about the importance of framing questions that invite students to think. I think we also need to teach students how to frame those same questions. And I'm saying that because I want students to become thoughtful in the questions they ask, and in fact, if I said to a student, look, I can answer 2 questions today, make sure they're your best questions. Don't ask me questions that you can look up. Ask me questions, let's engage in good conversation. I want to get students themselves to know how to frame meaningful questions that are worth exploring. So part of preparing students for that is to be not just problem solvers, but problem finders, so that they're asking the questions that raise the issues, and then that we give them the tools. I've been doing some work around something we call, I'll just give you a really quick overview of it. We've been talking about something called curatorial thinking. And curatorial thinking, how to make students curators of knowledge in an information-rich world. And we define this as having 3 key phases. The first phase is being able to select. How do I decide what information I can trust? What is useful? What is reliable? How do I become a curator of information? How do I then make we call it sense making. So after I've selected the sources of information that I think I can trust? Can I make sense of what I'm reading? And then lastly, how can I share it with others in a way that makes sense? So curatorial thinking involves both the selection, the sense making, and the ability to share it. And I think this is going to be one of the big things going forward in this information rich world. The other thing I just want to say very quickly is related to curatorial thinking is this idea of what we call prospective thinking. Prospective thinking is future-oriented thinking. So if I were teaching history and I asked students to determine whether a historical leader was an effective leader, that is a critical thinking question, because they would apply criteria to decide whether or not this character was effective as a leader. It's not prospective. So how will that help me going forward? So when you ask the question about preparing students for the future, I think the more we can frame the learning in our classes around through a prospective lens that has them think about, you'll notice in one of my examples, I had students thinking about past civilizations through a prospective lens. Say, how can they teach us about what to do going forward? If we are learning from the pandemic in a prospective way, then we should be looking at the impact of the pandemic right now, not just through the lens of science, but through the lens of economics, through the lens of mental health, through the lens of societal issues, and prospectively thinking about what can we take from our experience in this moment that will better prepare us for the next time this happens, or when something happens like that. I think there are many, many opportunities that we need to seize in education to add a prospective lens so that students see value in whatever they're learning to help them be better prepared for the world they're going to live in. But that means we can't just ask questions about the topic, the content, but how does this help me in science, in economics, in sociology, whatever it might be. I'm just reading a question about...
yeah, we have another question, I guess. Yep.
So I'm reading a question on, does thinking critically vary from one cultural context to another?
From Dr. Muga.
Yeah, that's a very good question. Certainly, I think I would suggest that when we dig down into those intellectual tools that I talked about, I think sources of knowledge is certainly an area where there will be differences in various cultural contexts in terms of what information, how do we build knowledge, where does knowledge come from? I'm not sure that, what's been interesting for me is I've worked with schools from China, the Middle East, South America. And I think that the idea of students engaging in making thoughtful decisions using criteria and evidence to reach decisions, that has seemed to travel quite well across cultural context. The sources of knowledge and information and what we value seems to differ. So I think I would suggest to you that it lies less in the definition of what defines critical thinking, but more in what we accept as knowledge. And I think those are areas where we have to be thoughtful about. I think in the West, we certainly have some Western biases about what counts as legitimate knowledge, and we can adopt. So I think adopting a much more thoughtful approach in terms of how we reconcile diverse views would fit within that. But the construct of how we reach thoughtful decisions has for me transferred well across cultures.
Okay, thank you very much. Another question? Yes.
Mr. Sana, am I allowed to ask any question here?
Of course, yeah, you're welcome.
Thank you. Professor Garfield Newman, and it is yet another very informative and perhaps it is very thought-provoking and thoughtful session which I attended today. I would make one. I would try to make a question by framing it from the perspective that what I have understood from certain student agency related issues. I have found out that there has been larger global economic arrangement or economic order, may I call it economic order, that has been pushed by a specific political order. So there has been synergy between economic order, global economic order, and the political order. That has been actually, giving birth to consistently a kind of set of ideas. Those ideas have been declared that these are the ideas which are basically a kind of ideas that can be legitimated, that can be accepted, that can be considered considered true ideas, and those are the ideas which can actually bring some kind of success, or it can mean that it is going to bring you economic security and political security and rest of the things. So that means that the very idea of thinking and the very idea of ideals of the idea have been on the idea of either legitimate one or not legitimate one or illegitimate one, and which is very fearful thing. When I posed certain question to my students for the past 10-15 years, there has been certain worldview on the part of the students, and that worldview has not been very different from the areas which are relatively advanced areas. But still those ideas are actually those ideas are rooted somewhere in the larger economic and political structures, which are being shown through the digital screening, which are being shown through the media intellectuals, and which is being actually I mean, there has been large scale worldview that has been consistently and vigorously being promoted and being presented and shown. So, I mean, the alternatives, when I talk about the alternatives are few and far between, and they are becoming very much, excluded one, and they are excluded from the mainstreaming. I mean, their mainstreaming has been problematic now. The alternatives are now, becoming a kind of question mark on the questions, that people are not being comfortable with those ideas, because those ideas are bringing them a kind of idea of the life that is actually suited to their requirements, the present day requirements. And I think when I try to relate it with, there has been general apathy on the part of individuals when it comes to global climate change effects, because their ideals and their thinking and their objectives are not corroborating, are not actually are not actually getting any space when they try to think alternatively, that climate change is being generated or being created because of mindless urbanization and mindless idea of ambitious idea of development, and in the name of development we are basically creating problem. I mean, the people are actually people are made to enter into a kind of imagination process. I mean, their imagination machine has been problematized, and now people can only think, and even students and their teachers and their ideals are framed in a matter that they can't actually go outside those specific structured constructed ideas. So my problem is, and I would like to ask you a question, that how we teachers and how we can actually adopt strategies through which we can actually change these imagination machines, which are heavily influenced by the global political economic ideals and the ideas which are mainstreamed, and how we can actually talk about the alternatives which can actually set the tone of egalitarian society, which can set the tone of societies where kind of values which are basically genuinely I mean, Henry uses the terms of radical democracy, how those values can be actually promote the idea of radical democracy, and how actually critical idea and critical thinking can be actually promoted among the students and teachers. Thank you very much. I hope I have asked the question.
You asked a huge question. That's there were a number of times in the comments that you were making that it struck me that the opportunity to pause and unpack with students, what assumptions are we making about what success means? So just as an example. So let's talk about the criteria that's being used. What is being imposed on you as a definition of success? Are those the correct criteria for success? What if we were to rethink how we're defining success? How would that impact? It was interesting. I don't know if you've seen it in the news, but Biden's speech last night, essentially it came 40 years to the day after Reagan's speech, and it is a directly opposite assumption. So Reagan's speech was, lower taxes, get governments out. And Biden has completely flipped that and said taxes are going up and government should play a bigger role. This is a great opportunity for us to say, so what does success look like? Is it larger corporations at the expense? Is it this? How are you going to define success? I think we have to be careful, by the way, to not impose our definition, but to invite students to engage in their construction of what are. And I love the fact that you're saying, so what if I were to present to you, and by the way, think of my cascade notion. I want, that's a good question you're asking, to be the first day of the class and to ask students to think about what is the kind of world they want to live in. Now, as we go through, I'm going to present multiple alternatives, but you have to ground your decisions in a set of well thought out criteria that define success, and not a set of criteria imposed by some general kind of sense of what we've defined success to be. But there were a lot of things within your question that open that door to challenge students to think about, how are we defining that? How are we defining that concept? What if we thought about it differently? What might that look like? How might the criteria there? How do we look through multiple perspectives to consider alternatives? Sorry, I just have to check. Anyway, one of the dangers in these kind of questions as well is that, it's finding that way through to engage students in the exploration of possibilities and alternatives without them feeling like, my worry is that our education system generally has students thinking that I need to adopt the professor's view. That's how I do well in a class. And I really have to try to create the climate to say, it is not getting top marks in my class is not telling back what you think I believe. And that's one of the big challenges in the kind of question you're asking, is that I don't want students simply to adopt what I think the answer should be. I want them to be able to develop and defend their own view, even if it's contrary to mine. How do we do that? How do we give them that space to argue? I put my email, if you just scroll up to the top, I put my email in the chat, and my Twitter are there.
Yes.
And this would be a great conversation for us to continue. So I just want to take a look at, there's another question here.
Would you like me to read it, or?
You can. I'm just reading through it just so I can.
Okay, so as for Hassan, she asks that, as a student, isn't that how students have always been, young and easily influenced by the people around us? First, we are influenced by our family, then our teachers and peers, and finally the society and media. I think all of us are influenced by other point of views, one way or another. As a university student, I'm a collection of almost all the ideas and thoughts I encountered throughout my lifetime. And it's not a question, actually, it's just a comment to your speech.
Yeah. That's a very good, and I think what this raises for me, first of all, it raises that, Asfa, you start from, as young children, we're influenced by our family around us. It says to me, by the way, the critical thinking that I'm talking to you about needs to begin in kindergarten. and the work that I've been doing with schools is, how do we, from a young age, try to frame schools in a way that invite the kind of thinking that we're talking about. So I'm just reading. So how do we embed this and at a young age so it becomes a way of learning, and that students should become, I mean, you're absolutely right. They're going to be shaped by the media that they watch, their peers, their families, their communities. This is why, in my view, helping students become critically thoughtful consumers of those influences, not merely blindly accepting, but thoughtful about their values, what makes sense to them. I just recently framed a unit with a teacher in Poland. They're reading a novel called The Outsiders, but the question that we asked is for students to consider, and I'll just put it in the chat. Here's the critical thinking question. Sorry, it's going to get.
Okay, if there are not any questions, I want to just to summarize our today's webinar.
So I just put in the chat there, the question that we asked, I forgot my question mark. Do our circumstances or our choices do more to shape who we become? These are grade 7 students thinking about, is the family you're born into, the wealth that your family has, or poverty, which does more, or is it the choices you make? Of course, the truth is both play a role. And as students go through this novel study, they're continually gathering evidence about how the characters are being shaped one way or the other. And it's in getting them to think about their own lives. Who are you going to become? What will shape your values? I just want to really, really quickly, Asia mentioned the Foundation for Critical Thinking in the early years. You're absolutely right. And I in fact, just the other day, I just did a session for just kindergarten to grade 3 teachers on Monday. I chose higher ed because I was trying to anticipate what people teach that are in this group. If you are interested in what would this look like in kindergarten, what does this look like in grade 1? Or in fact, even better, I have a critical challenge going on now with schools around the world where children in primary grades are doing an inquiry into spring, and they are sharing how similar or how different is this time of year in different parts of the world. We have schools involved from South Korea, Uganda, Poland, South America, Central America, North America. So if you know anyone who'd like to get involved, but it's getting children to use evidence and criteria to make decisions when they're in grade 2. Or if you want to see any other, if you are interested, what does this look like with younger kids or in the arts or in other subjects? I could certainly send you lots of different materials to have a look at. Sorry, I'll turn that back over to you.
I guess that the homes we're born actually shape our identity more than the circumstances, but the circumstances and society, for sure, just to add some important features and criteria to our identity and to our opinions as well. So it's just 50-50, I guess, but mostly, of course, our homes where we were born, for sure. It was such interesting presentation, as well as the discussion. I would like it to be longer. And I guess that it was very valuable, informative, inclusive, and engrossing, not only to students, but to educators, as well as the teachers. And they will grab actually some useful information, prolific information from your presentation and from your speech. So I want to just to sum up today's webinar that happened thanks to PAS and in collaboration with that society. So I wanted to invite Dr. Abdullah Mughal for concluding our webinar. And I want to thank PAS as well for including me to this session. And I was honored to be a moderator of such interesting presentation. So please, Dr. Abdullah Mughal. you're welcome to conclude today's webinar. Okay, Dr. Abdullah Mughal, he says that Amir Raja, because of his microphone is not working. Oh, okay, I'm so sorry. Then Dr. Amir Raja. Dr. Amir
Thank you
Raja.
so very much, Ms.
Yep.
Afsana. Thank you so very much.
You're welcome.
Yeah, thank you. And it was great honor that Dr. Gary Field, Ginny Newman has honored us, has honored his tremendous ideas, tremendous views, and it was a kind of session which I'm sure all the participants who have participated in it, who have attended it, it is going to go long way to actually think about this idea of idea of critical thinking and idea of agency, and particularly the idea of building capacity among the students and among the teachers as well. I mean, this was holistically a kind of idea and a kind of theme that is very critical, and that is very crucial at this moment across the globe, because across the globe, when we look at the across the globe political leadership and other issues, we somehow become bit upset, and it is worrisome thing that the global intellect has not been actually approaching different issues which are globally confronted, and still the profit making has been an essence of all global political elite, that is not actually realizing that how actually they can sit together and how they can resolve the global crisis, global issues, economic issues, and how actually this global issue of climate change that has started showing its issues of global health in the form of recent the global spread of this pandemic has been a kind of mere one indication that demands that how we can actually go back to idea of this critical thinking and idea of agency, through which we can actually approach these global crises and global issues more effectively. And I think it's high time that we must promote such learning and interactive sessions with the help of these scholars like Garfield and other scholars who have been actually working in this same area. And I am actually very glad to say once again thank you so very much, Professor Gary Field and Ms. Afsana as well, that you have accepted our request on the part of PAS and on the part of the society and both of these organizations. And I feel honored that I am actually finding an opportunity to actually say these comments and compliments to both of you, that you have actually organized a very good session, and we look forward, and we very hopefully look forward that Mr. Gary Field and Ms. Afsana would be actually once again giving us another opportunity at another time that we can actually have and hold good sessions like this, so that we can actually keep on discussing and keep on actually talking about these ideas with better themes, with better ideas. I think the ultimate purpose is that how we can actually join hands together to make this world more developing place, and how we can actually promote the idea of democracy across the globe. Thank you so very much once again.
Thank you very much, Dr. Amiraja, for such compliments. I'm honored actually to host Dr. Garford as well, and to see you and have the opportunity to be a moderator of this interesting presentation. Hopefully to see you in next sessions. Thank you very much for all participants. Dr. Garford, it was inclusive. It was great. Thank you very much. Hopefully to see you in our next sessions. So
Wonderful.
Take care, please.
Thanks so much.